When we first are introduced to one another, what's the first thing we do? We shake hands. That's right. So I would love it if all of you right now would take just 30 seconds and turn and shake hands with one person who is not in your family. Can you do that? Shake hands with one person who is not in your family. Tradition, and in the Presbyterian tradition, it's hard to get 3 words out of anybody. So I was delighted that you greeted one another. But I imagine that you went like this and looked them in the eye and shook their hand. You didn't really look at their hand. I'd like it if right now you would turn and look at your own hands. Just look at your hands for a second. Look at your hands. Clean for a change. That's right, Serge. Clean for a change. You don't let them get out much, do you, Carolyn? Each of you has a different hand, a different fingerprint, each unique. I asked you to look at your hands because I wanted to ask you, what is on your hands today? Let's go through several of these hands. Some of you have a hand that just looks normal. It's a normal day for you. Some of you, if I were to shake your hands, I would feel like you are a very accomplished person. Others have hands that are broken and dirty. Some of you have hands that could play the piano. I can barely hold my pen. While others of you have hands that are scarred. Some of you have hands that are old and gray and they feel tired. And some of you have hands filled with power and you use that power, whether well or badly. People would say your hands are powerful, while still other ones of you have hands that if I were to look inside your heart, your hands would feel like life is drifting through your hands. I'd like you to remember what is in your hands. I had the great privilege of going to the nation of Haiti almost 40 years ago, my first mission trip. Just off the island of Haiti, there is a tiny little islet called Lagonau. It means cheese. It's just like a little slab of cheese that sits in the Caribbean. And there, the children are so poor that half of them have no clothing on. It is a place where Christianity is in battle with witch doctors. And I was there because we were going to help a missionary clinic. Now this was in the 1970s, but their equipment looked like it was from the 1870s. It was very, very rustic. There was almost nothing there. But they were so proud that they were training nurses in Haiti to care for others. And they showed me step by step all the way around, and we got to the last little cinder block room, probably no bigger than this up here. And there are nurses in there changing the bed. And there's a little boy on the bed. And he looked about 3 years old, and I said, what's with Jean? Oh, he's 11. He's a tiny. I said, what's wrong? And they said, well, he came to us with an infection, and I fear that we've gotten him too late. I fear going to die. And I noticed that he was not wrapped in bandages, but rather in newspaper. And I said, why in newspaper? Well, we got him so late that he keeps ripping at his arms, ripping at his legs, and we just cannot afford bandages all the time, and so we wrap him with bandages, and then we surround the bandages with newspaper. Would you mind doing us a favor, they said, as they changed the bed, would you pick him up? So I picked him up, and I said, what's his name? And they said, his name is Jean, which is my name. And I looked at his eyes, were about this big, looking up at me. And then, like children do, he just went and collapsed. You know how when children fall asleep on you, like that little one back there, there are no bones left in their body. They're just a little blob that melts right into your chest. and that was little Jean sleeping. I'm sure it was only 2 minutes, but it felt like 20 minutes. I rocked him. I put him back down and ran out of the clinic saying goodbye and drove off in our Jeep to the water project I think we were going to next. And I looked down at my hands, and the newspaper print from little Jean's body had soaked the ink into my hands. And so I knew what I cleaned it, so I did. Of course, I'm a guy. I put it on my pants. And now my pants are filthy, and my hands are still filthy. And by the time we got the next hour to the station where the well was, the ink had soaked deep into my hands. So that when I scrubbed it, it still wouldn't come off. When I came back a week later, my wife goes, "What happened to your hands?" And I said, "It's a long story." But every time I saw my hands for the next month or so, I thought of little Jean. And I prayed for him. And by the grace of the good God, he's still on my hands. What's on yours today? Lord Jesus, I pray that your word would speak to us, to our head, and our souls, but that your word would also speak to our hands. That you would bring life in all its fullness through your word, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit. Amen. I'm not sure if I got into the bulletin, but I had said I wanted to tell you Jesus' favorite Bible story today. I'm sure that it's Jesus' favorite Bible story. I learned it actually when I was finishing seminary. I call it cemetery sometimes. But seminary is where you go to learn to be a pastor, and you graduate, and then you come out and you are called to be a pastor to a congregation. But before that, you have to be examined by all the other pastors and elders. It was actually a church much like this on the plains of Colorado. Much like this, it was an evening, and because it was a formal time, all the pastors were in their robes. And they were inquiring, they were testing 3 of us who were candidates to be pastors, asking us all kinds of pastoral counseling questions and theological questions and biblical questions, and it went on and on. I was the 3rd person to go. The first person, they asked 2 questions, and she sat down. I thought, this is good. The second person was seated next to me. He got up, and he was from Princeton Seminary, a very famous school in our country. And he got up, and they were coming after him, and he was so smart. He knew more about the Bible than I think some of my professors knew, and he was just doing great. And I was getting very nervous because I knew that I was not from Princeton Seminary. And he's just about to sit down, and a man came down the aisle, a little old man in a tattered old robe, and he fumbled at the microphone. They apparently did not use microphones in his church, and he said, "Young man, I just have one question before you're finished. Could you tell me, sir, how does the theology of Hosea affect your ministry?" And I'm sitting there going, "Hosea, I know Hosea. Hosea, who's Hosea?" And unfortunately, so did Princeton. Princeton had no idea either. So when you are asked a question in school and you don't know the answer, you just write down everything that you do know. So the young Princeton started to answer the pastor. He goes, "Well, of course, sir, you know that Hosea was one of the middle prophets." That's right. They call them the minor prophets. There are the 5 major prophets, you know, and he named those. And then 12 minor prophets, he named those too, because he had no idea what he was going to say next. And he said, "I remember that Hosea lives at the same time that the prophet Isaiah does, and Micah and Amos. This is right after the nation of Israel has been in a civil war, and Hosea lives up north. Now, this guy has already said much more about Hosea than any of us will ever know, right? And he's not answered the question. And he turns to the pastor and he said, "Sir, would you give me a hint?" And the pastor smiled and he said, "Yes, I'd tell them about Gomer." Gomer. Well, there's a famous TV series called Gomer Pyle, but that's not who you mean. And then the pastor leaned forward and said, "Would you like another hint?" And Princeton said, "Oh, please." And I took that hint, and I passed my test. And I went home that night and I read the entire book of Hosea. Because the book of Hosea is known for really many things. It's the book where we get the idea that they have sown the bad seed, and now comes the whirlwind. They will reap the whirlwind. That's the book of Hosea. It's the job of Hosea to tell the last king of Israel that the storm is coming. But this is Jesus' favorite story. I think growing up, Jesus would have learned much more about Hosea than Princeton or I ever did. He would have heard it every year as they read through the prophets. Hosea, you see, we talked about names. The name Joe for Hosea is really Joe. We'd call him Joe. The prophet Joe doesn't sound as very prophet-like as Hosea. Hosea is a part-time prophet and a part-time farmer and a part-time consultant to the king. The problem for Hosea is that these are very good times for Israel. Things are going well in the economy. There's no enemies right at the door. Good times for the country are bad times for the prophet because nobody wants to listen. Everyone is too busy chasing the American dream or the Israeli dream or the dream of whatever country you are in instead of God's dream. The first time I preached this and said that they were all chasing their dreams, a young woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "I realized that I have been chasing the American dream with Jesus sprinkled on top." Not a bad person, not a bad people. But Hosea is called to speak hard words. Listen to how the book of Hosea begins. The word of the Lord came to Hosea during the reign of the last king of Israel. The Lord said to Hosea, "Go and marry an adulterous woman, marry a woman who's having affairs, and have children that show that she is unfaithful. Because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery, departing from the Lord." So Hosea married Gomer. That was the hint. Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she bore him a son. But the Lord said, "Call the boy Jezreel, because I'm going to punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. That day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Now, Jezreel is the first son's name, but if Hosea were naming him today, he would call him Auschwitz. He'd call him genocide. He'd call him Rwanda, so that we would think of thousands of deaths. It's a troubling way to start the story of God. When prophets speak, they use symbols. Ezekiel the prophet breaks a jar to talk about a broken covenant. Jeremiah the prophet wears an ox yoke. Isaiah the prophet is called by God to walk through the city naked for 3 years. At least Hosea said, "At least I don't have to walk naked, do I?" But God commands Hosea to marry Gomer. And he intimates, he says right out loud, this marriage will not turn out well. I've done some of those marriages. So where you're not sure that they know what they're getting into. You're up here and the couple is there and they think it's going to be fine. And you go, oh, I don't know. And there's that part of the wedding service where you go, does anyone have objections to this service? Please, somebody object. And that's Hosea and Gomer. Gomer's a good woman, and she's a good woman that wants the good life. But Hosea is just a farmer. He can't give her the good life. So it says that Gomer starts having affairs, starts seeing other men and sleeping with other men, even after their firstborn, the disastrous child named Jezreel. And so it goes on. It says that Gomer conceived again, and the Lord said, call her Rohamah. Lo means not, Amah, Lo Romah, not beloved. I am unloved because I don't love him anymore. And after she had weaned Lo Romah, Gomer had another son. And the Lord said, call him Lo Ami. Lo means not. Ami means my God. You're not my God. You're not my kid. I'm not your God. And this looks like this relationship between God and Israel, between Hosea and Gomer. It looks like a bad marriage gone sour, heading for divorce court. And then to make it worse, Gomer just moves out. She leaves. We don't think probably that the kids went with her. Sounds just like a lot of marriages today. But the same voice that told Hosea to marry Gomer speaks again. And in chapter 3, God says this. The Lord spoke to me and said, Go and love your wife again, even though she is loved by another and is faithless. Love your wife the way the Lord loves Israel, even though they turn to other gods. And down a bit it says, so Hosea says, so I bought Gomer back for 15 shekels of silver. It was half of my crop. And then I told Gomer, you're to come live with me from now on. You must not give your love to another, and I will live with you. What this is saying, in its very realistic biblical way, is that Gomer abandons Hosea. And then God says, go get her, bring her back. And so Hosea has to go out into the red light district. And he finds her among the prostitutes. The reason we know that he finds her among the prostitutes is that Gomer has to pay a pimp to get his own wife back. He has to mortgage half of his crops. But Hosea and Gomer are standing in front of each other, and he looks at this broken down, beautiful on the outside woman and says, no more running around. Let's work on this. The best words in the book of Hosea. Let's go home. Let's go home and begin again. And then it goes on. It says in the text, you know that faithless, disastrous child? Let's call him faithful. And the other one that says, you're not my God, let's call her grace, to remind us of the grace of our God and the chance of a new beginning. That's the book of Hosea. It would be lovely to say that they lived happily ever after. But we just don't know. We just know that there was a man who loved a faithless woman so much that he went out into the streets and found her and brought her back. And when you get to that part of the story, isn't there a little part of you that says, wouldn't you love to be loved like that? Wouldn't you love somebody that no matter what you did, no matter what you've said, no matter what you've done, that you would be loved no matter what? That's the story of Hosea. It's the story of God's love for each one of us. And that's why I believe that this is Jesus' favorite story in the whole Bible. I believe they get to the story of Hosea in the synagogue, and the rabbi stands up and goes, "Hear now the word of God through the prophet Hosea." And Jesus sits up straight, pokes his dad, says, "This is my favorite part." He hears it again and again and again growing up. I believe that there is a little Gomer in all of us, every one of us. There's a little Hosea in all of us. So as you hear this story today, who are you like? That's why I asked you, what's on your hands today? Are you more like Gomer in this story? You're not a bad person. Gomer was not a bad person. But do you live in both worlds? Do you live in the world of school where you're one person, in the world of church where you're the other? Do you live a different value at work than you do at home? You're not bad, you just want it all. And sometimes following God is not convenient. Or when you look at your hands, are you like Gomer at the end? Beaten, literally beaten. Standing in front of her husband, ashamed, wanting to hide. And when Hosea says to Gomer, when God says to you, "Let's go home," do you feel like it's too easy? Like it's too good to be true? You want to believe it, but you're not sure that you can live up to it? You want to believe it, but you're not sure you can live it? Or are you today a person whose hands are a lot like Hosea, like Job? In every story like this, there are good people that get hurt. And they have to forgive again and again. They have to see that the lesson of Hosea for Hosea is not to get judgmental, it's to get forgiving. It's not to run away, it's to begin again by the grace of God. Well, that's what I learned that night when I heard the story of Hosea in my room. And I decided that if I were ever going to preach on Hosea, that I would say first that Hosea teaches that sin is no small thing to God. Sin is a big deal. And this story is a great reminder of why sin is hard. Sin to God is like watching your spouse kiss someone else. It's like watching your daughter run off with someone that you go, "No!" That's what sin feels like to God. My wife and I were a young pastoral couple, and our best friends were a young pastoral couple, and they were in the city of Chicago, and we had no money at all. And so we decided we would go to the nicest restaurants in Chicago because we had one of these little coupon books where you got two for the price of one. And we'd go anywhere as long as it was in the coupon book. So once a month we would go to lunch, to dinner. And one day we went to a very nice restaurant, and I got in there, and just as we get in, my friend who's also a pastor turned to me and said, "Did you hear about Gordon MacDonald, who is my mentor?" I said, "No, heart attack?" He said, No, sex attack." Oh no. Yeah, he's been unfaithful. And the women, our wives, heard it from Gordy at the same time. I will never, to the end of my life, forget that both of our wives burst into tears. I said, honey, what's wrong? And my wife turned to me and said, "If it could happen to Gordon MacDonald, it could happen to you." I was like, "It's not my fault." And my friend said, "Oh, this is why we need grace, Laura. This just happens." And she stopped him right there in the middle of this crowded restaurant and practically yells, you can ask her next week, practically yells, "This doesn't just happen." I was like, "I didn't do it. It's not me." This doesn't just happen, Gordy. No one's safe, are they? I decided right there we were never going to that restaurant again. But it also reminded me of the consequences of sin, that it's not just heartache, it's hardness of heart. It's the idea that unforgiven, unrepented sin leads to separation from God. You run away from God. You rebel. Hosea teaches me that. Hosea also teaches me, though, that God gives broken goods new names. God gives used goods new names. God is not interested in polishing up your outside. He wants to give you a new heart, a fresh beginning. Listen to this. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not a second chance. The gospel of Jesus Christ is being raised from the dead. It is being rescued. Jesus gives new names to show there is new life. Simon becomes Peter. Saul becomes Paul. Would you like a new name today? Hosea teaches people about real love. How many of you love things? I love things. I love chocolate. Chocolate loves me. I love French fries. I love American football. I'm not too bright. I say I love God. But Hosea teaches me what God's love looks like. Hosea teaches us that we are bought with a terrible price. In the story of Hosea and Gomer, it's half of all of his wealth and great shame. When Jesus teaches the story of Hosea in the New Testament, he teaches that God loves us with a terrible price, with a cross. That there is nothing our God will not do to bring us home again. I know that this is the favorite story of Jesus the Messiah because he retells this story as his most famous story in the Bible. Jesus says, once a man had 2 sons, and the one son demanded that his father give him the inheritance, and he went far from home and lost it all. That's the story of Hosea, the prodigal son. And the best verse in the Bible, for me, the best verse in the Bible is the prodigal son, far from home, living in pig slop, who raises his head and says, when he came to his senses, not when he was made to feel ashamed, not when he was told the right path, not when people told him, oh, bad, 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 bad. When he came to his senses, he said, this is not how I should live. Can I ever go home again? In the story of Hosea, in some ways, it's even better, right? The prodigal son's father is looking out the window. He sees him coming. He runs off. In the story of Hosea, God goes out and finds you again and again. I told you that the old pastor gave 2 hints. But I didn't tell you what the second hint was. But this old country preacher turned and said, son, when you preach about Hosea, have your choir director finish with this song, O love that will not let me go. Because that's the gospel of Hosea. O love that will not let me go. That's why I asked you to look at your hands at the beginning. Because the prophet Isaiah, contemporary of Hosea, looks at people's hands. In chapter 49, he says, my people say that I have abandoned them, that God has abandoned his people. But can a mother abandon her child nursing at the breast? I will never forget you, says the Lord. And in these great words, he says, look, I have carved your name on my hands. The next time you look at your hands, don't see the filth, don't see the fear. See that God has carved his name on your hands. And he has said, you're mine. You're mine. Come home. Lord Jesus, I pray that whatever is on our hands today, whatever is in our heart, that you, as you did with Hosea, as you did with the prodigal son, you will send out your love. That you will bring the prodigals home. That you will give the children a new name. And you will turn to all of us who are unfaithful and say, let's go home. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost we ask. Amen. Would you all stand?